It's good to be with you all again today and add a little music even. It came from over there, right? And especially good. Let's sing another song. And and we of course take on a very tender topic today as we talk about death. And I do want to acknowledge that I think it's made even more piercing by the loss of one of your own recently, the passing of longtime member Deb Ellman. And her, as many of you know, her loved ones, including many in this room, memorialized her life yesterday. But I also want to acknowledge and think that it's more appropriate that we just take a moment of silence here for those who knew and loved her in honor of her life and love. So let's just take a moment together to remember Deb. Thank you. Death is, one of those subjects we often don't speak about, except in the maybe the immediate instance of when someone has passed. And but I think it's often something that I think we often think about, even though we don't talk about it much. I think it's something we think about a lot. I think we think about it when we lose a loved one, and we think about it when maybe we get a bad test result at the doctor, whether that be a cancer concern or elevated cholesterol. We think about it when we talk about or live into our retirements. We think about it when we have a scare while driving. Sometimes we think about it for no reason at all. Well, it's not always on the tip of our tongues. It's often in the back of our minds, a quiet specter shadowing our lives. That certainly has been true for me. As a child and a young teen, I had a very intense fear of dying. I used to have nightmares about it. Especially, I used to have nightmares about nuclear war. And I was frightened by predictions of a coming apocalypse that very much weighed heavily on me. I remember watching a television show about Nostradamus. Some of you remember that guy. And in that show, it claimed that he predicted the end of the world in 1994. He was a little off, I guess, but I remember as a young boy adding up the years and believing for a time that I would not live past my 23rd birthday. That made me nervous. That made me fearful for what was to come. And I'm 53 now, so I got a little further along the road than that. But as I grew older, I also developed this kind of sense that I would not live a very long life, that I would have a short life. And as many of my heroes did, Jesus and Abraham Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. and others, I felt that I would die for something important, that I would die as a martyr for a cause. But over time, I realized that this false premonition was definitely more driven by my own struggles with self-worth, believing such an end would make me important and special. That became very clear to me in my 20s when I was in seminary, when I took a class from Buddhist teacher Joanna Macy, wonderful human being and a remarkable class. And in the class, Joanna led this kind of like a ritual-like exercise that she would often do, and for us, that she would do for us and with us. And this one, it was called Embracing Your Death. Very fun, right? And in the exercise, which was really interesting, everyone picked a partner. So as part of this exercise, you'd pick a partner who then represented your death. That partner represented your death, and likewise, you represented theirs. And the exercise began with the group walking around randomly throughout the room as if you were living your life. So you're just walking around, a whole bunch of people. Imagine all of us just walking around in a circle, and there's one person in the room who's your death, and you're that person's death. And eventually you would meet the eyes of your death. You would meet the eyes of your partner. And in that instant, you began the process of dying. That was the marking of your death. And the process of your dying was slowly you would turn towards your death. And then you would walk gently towards them. You would walk towards them until you reached each other. And then as you felt appropriate, embraced, and which would then mark the ending of your life. So as I began this exercise back in my 20s in seminary, I felt this drive to get it over with really fast, to go and find my death and be done with it. And to my great surprise, though, I discovered that my death didn't want to have anything to do with me. Every time I tried to seek her out, she raced off the other way. And I gave up the pursuit and let my death decide when it was time for me to die. Finally, after a long while, when almost everyone else in the ritual had already died, my death and I accidentally caught each other's eyes. And slowly, very slowly, we walked towards each other and then held each other in a gentle and tender hug, embraced by a death that would not have me, nourished by a love that would not let me go. The experience awakened clearly in me my drive to and find importance and meaning through a life of sacrifice and martyrdom. For the first time, I considered the possibility that I might live a long and happy life. Remember my words my father had shared with me, rather than what you will die for, think about what you will live for. I think the contemplation of life and death comes naturally to us. It's not unusual or strange, although sometimes we make it unusual and strange in our culture because we're fearful of talking about it. It's actually quite human to think about it. It's natural. It's a part of who we are. It's something that is very special about being human. We are both aware of being alive and also of having to die. That's something, to a paraphrase of what Forrest Church said earlier. That's a very unique human characteristic of both being alive and being aware that we also have to die. Trappist monk Thomas Merton wrote, "Life comes into being without any invitation of our own. We suddenly find ourselves in it. And as soon as we recognize ourselves as alive, we become aware that we tend towards inevitable death. Such an awareness, of course, creates challenges for us as people." Merton cautions us. He says, if we do not gain some adequate understanding of our life and our death during the lifespan that is ours, our life will become nothing but a refusal, a series of complaints that it must end in death. Then the fear of death becomes so powerful that it results in a flat refusal of life. There's a famous story of how the Buddha became the Buddha, which simply means awakened one. That's just the direct translation of what the word Buddha means, awakened one. And the Buddha, says Siddhartha Gautama, he was born a prince, the son of a very powerful queen and king, according to this story. And at his birth, there was a prophecy about his life. He would either become a very powerful king that would unite all the lands around them, or he would become a holy man, teaching the people how to live lives of wisdom and compassion. His parents, wanting him to live a life of power and comfort, protected him from the outside world. They shielded him. He was never allowed outside the palace walls. He was given all the comforts he could imagine. Everything frightening or scary was kept from his view. He never saw anyone sick, and he never saw anyone old, and he never saw anyone die. All of that was shielded from him. And as the prince grew, though, he grew impatient. He wanted to see the world beyond the palace. And after years of pleading, his parents agreed to let him take a carriage ride through the village around the palace into the village. And before the ride, the king and queen, though, they sent their servants out into the village to make sure that no one sick or old or dying got anywhere near the parade. But as fate would have it, on his first ride, the young prince encountered someone sick. And this struck him. He'd never seen that before. He asked his chariot driver what that was and what he was seeing, and he explained it to him. And that very much stuck in his mind and his head. And he had trouble sleeping that night as he returned to the palace. And he sought out going on a trip the next day and taking another ride. He encountered someone old, and again he had questions. What is going on here? I've never seen anything like this. What is that? And it was explained to him, and he struggled with it, thinking very deeply on what that was. And then on the third day, he took another trip out, and he was out there. He encountered someone who had died, and that again challenged his sense of the world and what was going on and what was out there and what he had been shielded from. And stunned by all of this that he had never seen before, and suddenly present to a life that had more loss and hardship than he could imagine, he left the palace to begin a journey of awakening and understanding. And after many years and much study, it is said that his journey culminated as he sat for 7 days underneath the famous Bodhi tree. And he radiated bliss and compassion while sitting there. And many asked him who he was, and he only responded, "I am awake." The Buddha revealed what he called the Four Noble Truths, which in essence say the cause of our suffering is attachment. There's a little more detail to that, but the cause of our suffering is attachment. And there's a Zen story that brings this out, I think, very powerfully. It's during the civil wars in feudal Japan, and an invading army would quickly sweep into a town and take control. And in one particular village, as this was coming, everyone fled the town, afraid of the army that was coming, except the Zen master of that particular village. Now, curious about this old fellow, the general of this army went to the temple to see for himself, having heard about him. He went to see it for himself what kind of man this master was. But when the general when he met the master and wasn't treated with the deference to which he was accustomed, he burst into anger. He grew very fierce and he shouted, "You fool!" And he reached for his sword. "Don't you realize I could run you through with my sword without blinking an eye?" But unmoved, the Zen master replied calmly, "And do you realize I could be run through by your sword without blinking an eye?" And the general bowed to the master. In the face of inevitable death and in our efforts to avoid addressing our attachments to life, we humans tend to tell ourselves lots of stories about how we live on. We tend to skip over the pain sometimes by telling us what comes after that prevents us from having to feel that concern or that fear or that loss. So honestly, we talk of things like heaven and hell, where a place of permanent reward is there for the good and a permanent punishment for the bad. And we talk of reincarnation, that our consciousness will return, rewarded with a good next life if we have behaved well, and a bad next life if we have not. We tell these kind of stories to ourselves, and I don't want to get into whether those stories are true or not. It's just something we do, though, as a response to our fear about what comes after, and not really knowing for sure what does. But when confronting the end of our lives, rarely do we deal directly with that feeling itself, that longing, what the Buddhists call attachment, that attachment to living forever. Rarely do we just deal with that basic feeling of want, of being drawn towards, of being attached to, I want to live forever. In Western culture, we often view non-attachment as numb and uncaring, that attachment defines how much something means to us. So if we're not attached to our own lives, if we're not attached to the lives of our loved ones, somehow we are uncaring. That's a perception that we often tell ourselves. But I wonder if, in fact, it's the exact opposite. Perhaps attachment keeps us from living our lives to the fullest. We live in fear, we live in protest. As Merton said, the fear of death becomes so powerful that it results in a flat refusal of life. The Buddhists teach us that when we are free from attachment, when we are free from craving, we become awake and compassionate. Our care for the world, for each other, does not diminish, it grows. I want to share with you what I believe is perhaps the subtlest and also most powerful form of attachment we suffer from. And at its very root of where our at its very root, I believe, is where our fear of death comes from. This is what I believe is our most powerful form of attachment. It's the attachment, and this may get a little esoteric, but it's the attachment to a false sense of self. That we believe who we believe we are is different from who we actually are. That we have an attachment to something other than who we actually are. And our fear of death comes from our desire for that false sense of self to live forever. Cy Safransky is the editor and publisher of The Sun, and he says, "Every day my ego perpetuates the most egregious kind of identity theft." One of the best ways I've heard this explained comes from the words of Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh when he tells us enlightenment is when a wave realizes it is the ocean. Enlightenment is when a wave realizes it is the ocean. We are waves who have forgotten that we are the ocean. When I was a little boy having nightmares of death, I wanted Forrest Gilmore to live forever. I was so afraid that he would die. When I was a young adult, thinking I would die as a martyr for a cause, I too wanted Forrest Gilmore to live forever, this time in the memory of others for my good deeds. It was just a different form of the same thing. But what I failed to realize, what I failed to notice was that Forrest Gilmore, the wave, was never separate from the ocean. Even when that wave inevitably crashes against the coast, it's never gone, because it was never anything more than what was already there. Enlightenment is when a wave realizes it is the ocean. Enlightenment is when a wave realizes it is the ocean. So you might ask yourselves, what do we do with that? And honestly, the answer is nothing. And not in the traditional way of nothing as a complete absence, but I think this is more of a journey, a lifetime journey of releasing rather than grasping. It's a letting go. It's a trusting. It will all be okay. It's going from this attachment I am grasped to this. And so if that's something, then it's so be it. But it's a releasing of something. You know, most of us will not have that Buddha awakening moment when we've got it. Aha, it's all here. I've got it. I'm under the tree and I understand it all. Maybe some of you might, but I don't think my life's going in that direction. But life still, life in its greatest beauty emerges. It emerges more and more each day as we settle into ourselves. as we settle into our true selves, as we settle into who we really are. Be at peace. It's okay. You are the ocean, and those you love are too. Shalom, amen, and blessed be.